Hi everyone, I'm Xander Jenkins, and this is my presentation on smoothing out the particles in fluid shock simulation. So, you want to run a fluid simulation. An issue that you're going to run into is the Riemann problem, where essentially you have, in your life, you have a fluid and it's moving dynamically, all the different parts are interacting with each other at the same time. But in a computer, you can't exactly render that. You have to break it up into parts, and usually that's done by breaking it up into a grid. And obviously the grid doesn't perfectly match what's going on, so how do you resolve this sort of step between them? And well, you fix the Riemann problem with a Riemann solver, or an approximate Riemann solver. And just to preface this is a very, very simplified explanation of how the Riemann solvers work, just the bare minimum that you need to know to understand what I'm doing. So it's not exact, but it's good enough. So essentially how the Riemann solver works that I'm going to be working with HLL is it goes through cell by cell, and when it reaches the edge, it compares the left and right sound speeds to compute the flux. And with the flux, you then know the mass, momentum, and energy of what's happening to the fluid in that cell, and once you know that, you know how the fluid is moving, and you're all good. So this rendering engine moves on to the next cell, computes flux, next cell, computes flux, and so on. So this is great. It's able to render the fluid, and we're able to do simulations with it and see what happens, but the issue is that it's only taking the left and the right sound speed and not taking into account what's happening in the middle, so there's some detail and fidelity that's lost there. A modified version of this is to add another point of contact, HLLC for the additional contact term, which adds the transverse sound speed that's between the left and the right. So it has this middle SM term, and this extra term allows for less diffusivity, more accuracy, and you can get some higher fidelity renderings with that. So this is great. We've got more detail with this new rendering engine, but there's a problem. There's an instability with it, and that's the carbuncle instability. So what is the carbuncle instability? Well, the easiest way is honestly to just show you. So this is a plane shock wave that's moving in the x direction in a uniform density field. You can see right here, the HLL versus HLLC, and you'll see all of this nasty noise that's developing right there in HLLC, which clearly should not be there. It's supposed to be nice and smooth. So you can clearly see that there's something wrong here, the instability that's growing in this simulation. But while you can see with your eyes, if we want to fix this issue, we need to be able to quantify it. And well, here what we can do is, because it's only moving in the x direction, this way, it's moving in the x direction, it ideally would have a y velocity at or very close to 0. It shouldn't have any y velocity, it's only moving in the x direction. And actually all of these little sharp edges that you see there are wiggles as a result from the carbuncle instability up and down. So if we plot the maximum y velocity over time, we should be able to see what's happening with the carbuncles. And in fact, if we do that, we see that HLL performing very nicely, very low y velocity, low error, doing good, whereas HLC grows exponentially and then sort of peters off. So, okay, if HLL is so good with the little errors and HLC is so bad, why would we even use HLC? Well, it comes down to that diffusivity helps when we have a non-uniform density. So this is another test with a density step from high to low, with the purple region right there. And once it hits the density step, it's kind of hard to see the differences between these, especially on a projector. The HLC is a little bit more fuzzy at the end. But let's change this from a straight line to a curvy sinusoid so we can get some more detail. And I'm going to move the sinusoid over to the left a little bit so you can really get a good look at what's going on. So we look to the left, boom, it hits the sinusoid, and you'll see these mushroom clouds start to develop as it goes through. Let's take a freeze frame right at the end, and I'm going to zoom in on each of these two mushroom clouds and compare the details. So here we have HLL on the left, HLC on the right. You can see that HLL, the shape is nice and good. It's nice and clean and smooth mushroom cloud, but HLC is all garbled. There's all sorts of, there's that little jagged swirl right there, and all this sort of, it's asymmetrical, and there's more detail in HLC, but the details are wrong. So we want higher detail than HLL. We want those extra details, but we don't want them to all be, mauled by the carbuncles that are causing all of this nastiness. So the question is, how do we fix the carbuncles? Well, if we recall back to how the rendering engines work, HLC, the only difference between HLL and HLLC is this extra term here, the transverse velocity. And so this must be what's causing the problem, and so I'll take the formula for how that's calculated. Again, there's a lot of different parts to it, but what's important is that I'm going to fix it using an error correction factor. So I'm going to insert a factor of theta, and I inserted the factor of theta into the sound speed in the code, and formula for theta. Again, there's a lot of different parts to this, but what's really important is this delta U, V, and W here, that I've highlighted, and it's U, V, and W for X, Y, and Z. This will work in three-dimensional simulations, but I'm only showing 2D, that takes into account the adjacent cells around what's being rendered. So again, recall HLC thinks the left, right sound speed, and what's in the middle. So HLC is looking at, for example, these two cells right here. My modified LHLC with theta looks at the surrounding cells and sees if there's any sort of extraneous velocities there. If there's not any sort of extraneous velocities, it cancels it out. So if a carbuncle is developing in these cells, theta will look in the other cells and cancel it out, and hopefully fix the carbuncles. So this is great. It's a great idea, but does it actually work? Well, let's see. My code works properly, and boom, no carbuncles. So LHLC is nice and smooth. There's no carbuncles, like it's nasty sibling over there. And if you take a look at the graphical Y velocity, perfect. LHLC is nice and low, almost zero Y velocity, unlike, again, its sibling that's going off and going like all that. So this is great. We've now eliminated the carbuncles, but does it hold up with the extra benefits of that extra C term? Well, let's redo the sinusoid test again. Let's see it hits it and watches these nice little mushroom parts develop. And again, I will take a freeze frame of the end. And let's go ahead and zoom in to all these carbuncles, all the mushroom clouds. I'll go through all three in a second. So here's HLL. Again, recall that it's a good shape, but it's a little bit blurry. And I'll flip between LHLC. So again, I'm going to have to look a little bit closely on the projector. You can see as I flip between, there's much more detail. I'm going to highlight. Laser pointer. You know what? But you can see at the top right here, there's that nice little hump at the top. That detail is lost in HLL, right? Wow, that's blurry. But without all of these nasty carbuncles of HLC. So great, we have no blurriness and no carbuncles. We've got this nice mushroom cloud with more detail with the rendering engine than we were able to before. So great, I've been able to code this. What's it useful for? Well, I've been showing you guys plane shockwaves, but this also works for radial shockwaves. And this, I'm going to show a test. This is not my test, this is someone else's. But this is a heat wave that's exiting a star's corona into the interstellar medium. And here we have a radial shockwave that's going from a high density zone into a low density zone with a non-uniform curving, so there's little humps on the thing, density set. So similar to the sinusoid test that I've done before, and a lot of these tests will be able to be redone if I were to redo them with my rendering engine. We'd be able to resolve more detail and look a lot more closely. And if you look at the one bottom right, right there, I'll highlight this. There's a lot of, see there's a bunch of noise, especially right along that middle line right here. And my advisor suspects that this might actually be a carbuncle or a carbuncle-like instability. And we'd be able to resolve a lot more detail of what's happening there. So, yes, these are the sources I've used. And thank you very much.
This might be beyond the scope of what you've done already, but I'm curious, have you looked into how this plays with the convergence of reconstruction order? So you're adding in this information from extra cells, can you still get, a third order convergence in a smooth problem, like this kind of numerical tests? Or is this kind of like affecting that as well?
I'm not sure. So that is a little bit of what I've been doing. I'm not sure, but
I'll make sure the formula
is
this a page, or I'll go back to
here. So again, it's sort of like addressing that sort of within the scope of what I've been doing. But I'm definitely down to like look into how this is calculated and change it to see if that affects.
Yeah, I imagine like you could do a test where you can shoot like a linear wave diagonally across a grid or something, and then you can measure, there's quantitatively how well does the code capture it, and it's interesting to know how this modification changes that at all.
Yeah. A lot of my future steps would be just taking my modified engine and doing a whole bunch of tests with it in all sorts of scenarios and see if it holds up in those as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with it.
Yes.
So I understand in the context of this what a carbuncle is, but just in like what's a carbuncle?
So it's kind of, and the reason so carbuncle is a word that kind of means like an infection or something like that.
Oh, great.
The main reason why it's called that is because if kind of grows as it goes through. You can really see it. It starts small and gets bigger. And with the growth of it, it doesn't just like magically appear. It starts at 0 and then grows exponentially and then kind of peters off. So kind of like an infection, it starts small and then grows and then eventually it kind of settles down. So yeah.
Now, who named that? Was it plasma scientists, astronomer? Who decided on that?
I'm actually not sure.
That's a good question.
It's a funny name though.
Yeah.
The carbuncle.
No, I didn't either. It's a good question.
I have a question. Did you look into using exact Riemann solvers? Because while you would never want to do such a thing in a production run because it's too expensive, it's useful for understanding pedantic cases.
Yeah, so I haven't looked into exact Riemann solvers. Again, all of these have been approximate Riemann solvers that I'm just comparing between each other. But I think that for the testing it, a lot of times, you know, approximate Riemann solvers are a lot more like efficient. And actually the sinusoid test with the mushroom cloud took me about 30 hours or so to render. So I think what I would probably, I would do a test with lower resolutions to like compare to an exact Riemann solver to see how well this holds up. I could do that in the future. Yeah.
But I think for exact solvers, the problem remains. I think it's really odd. Even the coupling of memory cells causes that.
Yeah, I mean, I would suspect that a carbuncle still persists with an exact 1D Riemann solver, but I've never actually seen whether or not that's the case.